Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on residential ventilation strategies. The webinar will be recorded and will be sent out to all attendees. If there are any issues with audio, please write me in the chat. My name is Erica DeLello, and I'm a project manager for Noresco. And this series is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by BuildTank. So Robbie and I have been working with the Colorado Energy Office just to provide trainings just like this one. You know, I think a few of you have probably attended our previous webinars, but here are the upcoming trainings that we have within this series. And then there will also be a link sent out in a follow-up email if you want to register for another webinar or send these webinars to someone else that you think might be interested. Feel free to do so. We are also offering tailored group trainings or technical assistance for jurisdictions. So if you are thinking about updating I-codes, please reach out. We're here as a resource for the state of Colorado and all jurisdictions. And then most of you may know about the Code Adoption Toolkit already and all of the awesome resources that are available on there. But today I wanted to highlight the latest resource, which is the Colorado Code Helpline. And the helpline is available to anyone in Colorado on any of the I codes or reach codes. So for example, if you're a jurisdiction and need assistance on a plan review or a homeowner or an engineer with a question about code applicability, you can submit a ticket and the subject matter expert, like Robbie, will get back to you in just a couple days' time. So you can access the helpline through the Code Adoption Toolkit or through this link. If you are doing a lot of plan reviews and need some assistance, you could even bookmark it if you like. So throughout the webinar, we want to encourage questions, of course, so please use the Q&A function and I'll let Robbie know at the end of the presentation. There's also the ability to raise your hand to ask a question. So if you do that, I can then unmute you at the end and you can ask Robbie and I directly. And then lastly, there's a survey window that pops up following the webinar. You can please take a moment to fill out that survey and provide feedback. We'll continue to improve on these webinars and continue to develop resources that you guys call out as needed. So with that, today our presenter is Robbie Schwartz, and he founded BuildTank to be a think tank to do research, education, and work with builders to ensure that their homes not only comply with codes and programs, but also perform. So with that, Robbie, I'll let you take it from here and share your screen.
Great. I forgot to ask you, Erica, but we have the poll questions.
Oh, yeah, forgot to mention that. Thank you. Yep, I've got the poll questions.
Okay, so
I will launch them as we go through.
While we start, I think we have our first poll questions to learn who's attending. So while we're getting that, our plan today is we're obviously talking about residential ventilation. And hello, everyone, I'm Robbie Schwartz. We're going to be talking about why ventilation in the first place. We'll talk about spot and local ventilation needs, whole house controlled mechanical ventilation, and we'll talk about this new requirement for commissioning or testing our ventilation systems as well here. Okay, so we have the majority of folks that are joining us today are code officials, but we have some engineers, architects, builders, and raters as well. So welcome and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to stop sharing my video so that you can concentrate on the slides. But again, if you have any questions, put them in the question box there and I'll put the video back on as we get to the end here. So we'll begin with a second poll question here, which is, why is this a 100-year-old house? We are pretty sure that this house is drafty, uncomfortable, yet it's a very durable house. So the question to me is, how can we have those two things going on? So let's give you a few seconds here to answer this question. The one thing that we should remember with regards to these older houses is when we're upgrading them, we really need to take into account the sound building science here. So the majority got this correct, is when it gets wet, it has drying potential. It's able to dry there. So if you didn't answer that way, then let's see if we can clarify some things here. So the big thing with these older houses, especially that have been around for a long time, is that our expectations of our houses have changed pretty dramatically. And with regards to new houses, we've changed the way that we build our houses to meet those new expectations. But we still need that house to be able to dry, because moisture is the single thing that destroys houses over time. So we have houses that were built in the past and houses that are being built today. And some of these changing expectations that make these houses fundamentally different from each other is that we have a whole new idea of what comfort means today, what efficiency means, what safety means, what indoor air quality and health means inside of house, how durable our houses are, and our understanding of how to continue to make them durable. All those things have changed around, but all of these things, all these changing expectations revolve around one key aspect of building science, which is really that we need to build our houses tight and ventilate them correctly. And so when we build our houses tight, we have to understand where that building thermal envelope is, where the air barrier systems and control layers are inside that house. And then we're asking from a ventilation perspective to stick a big hole in the side of the house. And when we stick this big hole inside of the house, we get questions all the time. You know, you're asking me to build it tight, yet you're asking me to build, to put a hole in the house, and it just doesn't make sense to me. So this leads us to our next question that I want to ask: can a house be too tight? It's a pretty simple yes, no answer. I'll give you a second here to reply. Okay, so the majority of people said yes, that a house can be too tight. That's 65%, and 35% said no. So the answer to this question is really a resounding no. Houses can't be too tight. One of the things that we need to understand when we ask this question is that we're really asking the wrong question, because what we're looking for with regards to house tightness is gaining control of that house. And in order to gain control of the house and the air that's moving through that house, we need to build that house tight. And so what is the real question we should be asking if house tightness isn't the correct question is, are our houses underventilated? And the resounding answer to that question is yes, our houses are underventilated. So we want to build tight and ventilate right. And these two things are really wed together here. And one of the big reasons we want to build tight is that air is not smart. Air doesn't know to follow these arrows and move through an open window from one side of the house to the other side of the house. If we don't have that tight house, we can't move the air through that house in the way that we want to, and we can't keep things that air is carrying out of our building assemblies here. What we do know is that air moves in a quantity, and we measure that quantity in a cubic foot of air, or CFM there. And we know that if 1 cubic foot of air goes into the house, then 1 cubic foot of air has to go out, or vice versa. 1 in, 1 out, or 1 out and 1 in. There's always a constant volume of air inside that house. Sometimes air moves in a predictable way, but we also don't know exactly where it's going. So stack effect is an example of, we can predict that as air warms, it rises, and it rises to the top plane of this house in this diagram here. And if there's a hole, it's going to leave the house. And we know that whatever quantity of air leaves the house, it has to come back in the house, but we don't know exactly where it's leaving and where it's coming in. So we don't really have a lot of control or predictability of that air until we actually build a tighter building envelope. And the code now helps us understand how to build a tighter building envelope. It's helping us define that building envelope as this boundary condition between conditioned space and unconditioned space. And it's actually asking us to depict that building thermal envelope on our construction documents now that are reviewed at a plan stage, that we have a better idea that the people building the house actually understands this idea of a building thermal envelope and the different control layers that we're using to control airflow, moisture flow, and heat flow through our houses, because those are the key things that we're worried about when we're talking about building tight and ventilating right, is getting these control layers to define that building envelope. And our control layers are our air control layer, our moisture control layer, our vapor control layer, and our thermal control layer. And when we have those control layers done correctly in our houses, we have a thermal envelope that when we're able to control and get predictability of thermal flow, airflow, and moisture flow. And today we're really going to be talking about airflow after we've gotten that control, how we're going to ventilate the house right, because we have control of the air going in and out of that house. Now, so some problems with ventilation system is to do with this idea of airflow, and that air is a transport mechanism. Air carries moisture and heat into and out of our houses. It's always moving moisture and heat around our houses. And therefore, when we're exchanging that moisture and heat into our houses and out of our houses across the boundary of that thermal envelope there, ventilation exchanges relatively clean air from the outside to the inside. But sometimes when we have red pollution days here in the Denver area, for example, we might need to be able to turn off that ventilation system in order to not bring in overly polluted air from the outside to the inside of our house. We are also needing to condition the air that we're bringing into that house there. So there is an energy penalty that's associated with ventilating a house because we're exhausting air out of the house, or we're taking air out of the house and replacing it with relatively clean air from the outside, but that air isn't conditioned. It hasn't been cooled or it hasn't been heated. So we need to continue to do that. So we worry a little bit about ventilation from a heating, cooling, humidification, dehumidification, depending on the climates that you're in, and also the ability to be able to filter that air. So the more control and predictability we have of the air moving in and out of our house, the better we are at conditioning that air, at filtering that air, at bringing the right quantity of air in and out of our houses, because we also want that ventilation air in that house, because it helps bring fresh air into the house for the occupants. It helps remove odors inside of our house. It helps dilute pollutants. So part of that slogan, the solution to pollution is dilution. So if we have relatively cleaner air outside, we're bringing it inside, we're diluting that polluted air inside the house with what we are saying is relatively cleaner air from the outside. We're also able to help ensure efficiency and durability and comfort inside of our house. We're able to control moisture levels inside the house with ventilation. All if we get this control and predictability, and that control and predictability comes from building a tight house. And that tight house that we want is that notion of building it tight, and then we need to ventilate it right for that background ventilation for the occupants and background of moisture control. And ultimately, this comes down to the HVAC systems, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems inside our house. That V part of the HVAC is the problem child, because a lot of HVAC contractors haven't spent enough time understanding the ventilation side of the equation here. So we want to make sure we understand infiltration and ventilation and how they're different from each other. Infiltration and exfiltration are that part of air leakage there that is unintended and accidental. This unintended and accidental movement of air across our building thermal envelope. Air in is infiltration, air out is exfiltration. These also create loads, because again, we have to heat and cool that air that's coming in and out of our house. So there's an HVAC load that's calculated through this. And we take that into account when we do a writes-off or an elite load calculation for the house. But if we get control and predictability, we can lessen or lower the load that infiltration or air leakage has on our houses. Now, mechanical ventilation also has a load, and we take that into account as well. But ventilation air is predictable, and we have more control in it. We put it at a specific rate, so I know how many cubic feet are coming in to ventilate that house. We put it at a specific schedule or time. It can be continuous or intermittent ventilation, so I know exactly how much air is coming in to that house, and I can take that load into account when I'm sizing my HVAC system there. So it is important to realize that ventilation, there is this load, there is this energy kind of penalty for ventilation, but we want to make sure that the health and durability of the house override that energy penalty for the house. Now, some ventilation systems provide some additional things like specific knowing where exactly I'm bringing that air in from the outside and exhausting it to the back out to the outside. And I might also be able to filter and distribute that air depending on the ventilation systems I choose to install in the house. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes here. But we need to remember that primary function of the mechanical ventilation is to bring in fresh air for the occupants and to have this background moisture control. So if you're seeing condensation on your windows in the wintertime, it's probably a ventilation issue there. We're not controlling the moisture content inside the house well enough there. Now, mechanical ventilation starts getting described in the IRC and the IACC kind of in the same way, but in both those codes there. And starting with the IACC, it says the building and dwelling unit shall provide mechanical ventilation. Now, the underlined portions here are new to the 2021 IACC. So we're getting down to a dwelling unit level in multifamily buildings. And we're talking now about mechanical ventilation. So we're not talking about just opening a window and having random airflow in and out of our houses potentially. Just because I open a window doesn't mean that air from the outside is going to come into the house at all. So we need that mechanical component as well here. So let's begin to talk about this mechanical ventilation with regards to spot or local ventilation. And we'll launch our next poll question here as we talk about spot ventilation from a kitchen, bathroom, and laundry perspective here. So the question is, what does the code care about when we talk about spot ventilation here? Okay, so the poll should be ending here. And yeah, so about 75% got this. We're talking about odor control, really an indoor air quality issue, and moisture control. Getting those things out as they're being produced, up and out of the house while they're being produced. As soon as that happens, that's really what spot and local ventilation. And that's why we're talking about pollution creation places like kitchens, bathrooms, and laundries. These are the main places where excess moisture and other pollutants are being produced here. So what we know with regards to spot and local ventilation is that there are specific ventilation rates that are called out in the IRC for kitchens and bathrooms. You can either ventilate intermittently or continuously there. We also know from a kitchen perspective that a lot of pollutants are created from gas cooking, from electric resistance cooking as well. A lot of pollutants are created. And just as we cook and heat food, there are a lot of pollutants that are created as well. So we need those hoods over these cooktops in order to get those pollutants up and out of the house as they're being produced here. We also know that this move to electrify our houses and to induction cooking enables us to reduce these pollutants quite a bit as well. And if anybody's interested, I just did a buildcast. My podcast on induction cooking, which is one of the biggest obstacles to the electrification of our houses there. So there's a little shameless plug for me to check out my podcast. Issues with exhaust ventilation is that the hood is not actually vented to the outdoors. So we're pumping those pollutants and potential moisture into building cavities if we're not venting them properly. The hoods make too much noise, so we're not actually using them. It doesn't move enough air, so we're not getting those pollutants out again. The hood's not present, or it's a recirculating hood that just dumps the pollutants back into our house with some maybe poor filtration that might be on it there, or the hood doesn't have the right capture efficiency. So when you're looking for hoods now, they are starting to rate the hoods with a capture efficiency number. The better the capture efficiency, the better the hood is actually going to work. But regardless of the hood that you have, and regardless of the type of spot ventilation we're talking about, everything needs to be discharged to the outdoors here. So you can't discharge into an attic or a soffit or a ridge vent or a crawl space or any of those locations. You've got to take that duct all the way to the outdoors, and you've got to locate that exhaust duct away from any intake air duct as well. This means that we need to discharge to the outdoors, and sometimes that's, I guess what I really am pointing out with this slide is that there's a loophole for these recirculating hoods. Unfortunately, manufacturer instructions still have a lot of sway with regards to installation when we're talking about the codes here, and these manufactured instructions give us a loophole, and this exception in the code gives us a loophole to continue to use recirculating hoods. But from a ventilation perspective, from a long-term durability and a health and safety perspective, we should really get rid of recirculating hoods as well here. Same with laundry vents, though. They have to be ducted all the way to the outdoors and shall terminate actually to the outside here. And we're really talking about installation of these duct systems that are ducted to the outside. They should be sealed and made airtight, just like any other HVAC duct there. So taped or ideally mastic there. And then we want to install them so that they actually function. In this case, you see the picture in the lower right-hand corner. The screw that's connecting the duct is impeding the ability for this damper to work. So it's actually not going to work. And if we don't duct it all the way to the outside, we're going to get potential moisture buildup and molds and other things happening inside our buildings or up in the attic on the underside of the roof sheathing and whatnot. So getting that spot location, spot ventilation system ducted all the way to the outside is super important. And there's a lot of the fan manufacturers, specifically Panasonic and Braun, have really good installation instructions for how to install the duct that's venting, taking that air from the fan to the outside. And just the biggest hint here is that we need roughly a 1 to 2 foot straight duct run out of the fan before we put any elbow to that duct, because you basically have to build velocity of that air and reduce turbulence in that air before, as it's leaving the fan housing, before it can actually get all the way outside through elbows in that ductwork that might be run there. But obviously we don't want to tie the duct into a knot like we see up in the upper right-hand picture up there. But these installs really impact the ability of that fan to work and local exhaust ventilation to work here. So let's move into whole house controlled mechanical ventilation systems here. Whole house controlled mechanical ventilation shall be provided. This mechanical ventilation, again, and down to the dwelling unit level in multifamily homes, we're talking about needing that ventilation. And it's called out in the IRC and the IECC now both. We're allowed to use supply side, exhaust side, or balanced ventilation systems according to the code. But we have to have some type of control that enables manual override. So if, for example, if I have that red pollution day outside, I might not want to ventilate it. Or if I have fire smoke hanging around like we had in Denver over this past summer, we might not want to bring air from the outside to the inside. So I have to be able to override those controls. But now the code, this other underlying section here says controls shall include text or a symbol indicating their function, which is super important because we don't want people turning off these systems and not turning them back on. We want them to understand why they're turning them off and why they should be running there. And then again, the mechanical ventilation rate is super important. So again, it doesn't matter if you install supply ventilation, exhaust ventilation, or balanced ventilation, but you have to decide what rate you're going to turn it onto and when you need it. So the code used to say in the 2018 and lower IRC and IECC that your house had to, if your house was tighter than 5 air changes, in essence, you had to use controlled mechanical ventilation. Now in the 2021 IRCC, it just says it has to be provided. It's basically been delinked from how airtight the house is. There's separate requirements for how airtight the house is. And now we need to ensure that we get that ventilation rate correct as well here. We also need to ensure that the fan that we use is efficient enough. So it's important to think about the watt draw that fan has from an energy perspective, because you're going to be running that fan continuously at minimum and intermittently potentially, but that fan can cost you from an energy perspective. So you want the lowest watt draw fan, and there is actually a requirement based off of this table in the IECC that you need to look at. Now, this is a hard thing to inspect for, so probably it's really something that needs to be inspected at the plan review side of the equation. So our next poll question has to do with ASHRAE 62.2. So let's run that. The question here is, which version governs the ventilation rate that's in the code? And the main reason I'm asking that is because we have the ventilation rate in the code, but it never specifically references the ASHRAE 62.2 standard that it's coming from. The other thing here is that when you're doing an ERI score, either for ResNet or for code, it also references an ASHRAE standard, and the code ERI changed the ResNet ASHRAE or the ResNet ventilation rate. And that's really the big reason why these two ERI scores are different from each other. So about half the people said the 2013 62.2. The next was the 2010 version, and then it goes down from there. So about a third said the 22 version. So the reality is that it's the 2010 version of the standard here. So it says where local exhaust or whole house mechanical ventilation is provided, and then it references the ASHRAE 62.2 2010 version of the standard. But again, it never says ASHRAE or 62.2 specifically. It's using this standard, and it's using the calculation method that is created by this standard. And it does that because this standard deals with controlled mechanical ventilation and spot ventilation flow rates. And it also is dealing specifically with the housing type that the IRC and the IECC are dealing with as well on the residential sides there on the IECC side. So just to give you an idea of the difference in these standards, the ASHRAE standard is a continual maintenance standard, maintained standard, so it's changing roughly every 3 years here. The ones that are most significant from a code perspective are the ASHRAE 1989 version, which introduced this 15 CFM per person and this 0.35 natural air changes rate. And so you might be familiar with that. This is where it comes from. If anybody does Building Performance Institute work in existing homes, this is where their flow standard comes from, and how you get your air sealing target if you're using the BPI standard in existing homes. But the interesting thing to point out here is the difference between the 2010 version and the 2013 version. Basically, the 2013 version is 3 times as much air being introduced into the house as the 2010 version. The code is still using the 2010 version. There's still a lot of dialogue and debate about how much air needs to be used to ventilate the house. And on the right-hand side, I give you kind of an idea of the difference in the ventilation rates that are created by these different standards here. But this is what's actually in the code right now. And this table comes from the ASHRAE 62.2 2010 edition of the ASHRAE standard. But again, it's not referenced in the code. So if I have a 1,500 square foot house and it's 4 or 5 bedrooms, I can put 75 CFM of air to ventilate that house with controlled whole house mechanical ventilation. Or I can use this formula to calculate a more specific ventilation rate. And so if the difference between the chart and the formula, is about 25 CFM of air. A lot of practitioners or energy modelers or raters, we like to be a little bit more specific. So we like to use the formula there, but if you're using the prescriptive path of the code, you might just use that chart there. And either are okay from a code perspective now here. But there is also a ventilation rate exception that says the ventilation rate may be reduced by 30%. If these following conditions are done, which is basically meaning that you're using a ducted system for supply ventilation, you're supplying that air directly into the living room, dining room, and kitchen, and you're also using a whole house ventilation balanced system there. The other part of this exception applies to any ventilation system, which basically says that you can run it intermittently instead of continuously. So if I have a ventilation rate of 100 CFM continuously and I decided to run it 50% of the time, I need to increase the rate to 200 CFM if I'm going to run it. And the chart below helps you figure that out as well here. So those are some things that we need to think about. As we get into the specifics of the different types of ventilation systems there, we really need to think about how these ventilation systems or philosophies are really climate specific. And the reason they're climate specific is because of how you're bringing that air into the house and what moisture content is in that air that you're bringing in or out of your house here. So again, we have these supply, ballast, and exhaust ventilation strategies. And let's start with the supply side ventilation system here. So supply ventilation, the big thing to know here is that it is a positive ventilation strategy, which means that it's positive pressure. We're pushing air into that house, and in essence, we're blowing that house up like a balloon. Any air that goes in has to go out of that house. And since we're blowing that house up like a balloon, we're pushing air against the building thermal envelope of that house, that boundary that separated conditioned space from unconditioned space. And we're in essence pushing air through holes in that building envelope. So again, it's important to know, is that air full of moisture and heat? And might there be a problem from doing that? So again, it's a pressurization strategy. In most moist climates, we recommend it because in general, there's less moisture inside the house than there is outside the house in Louisiana or Houston, for example, like that. So generally in those climate zones, a supply side ventilation strategy is liked better than an exhaust side ventilation strategy. But again, balanced ventilation would be the best, and we'll get to that here in a second. The other benefit of supply side ventilation is I don't need to deal with backdrafting of appliances because I'm positively pressurizing the house. I'm not going to backdraft an atmospherically vented appliance and create a combustion safety issue in that house. Building durability is a potential issue, as you see in the picture down below on the right-hand side here. I'm pushing warm, moist air through my building envelope, and I'm creating a moisture durability issue in that house. But I am able to create control. I know the air that's going in, and I know the air that's going out in this house. So I know the CFM rate, and I'm able to measure that and ensure that I'm getting that control of the specific amount of air that's going in and out of the house. I also have predictability because I can set it on a schedule here. I can either run it continuously or intermittently, but I know that schedule that I'm putting that air through. I'm also able to filter air that I'm bringing into the house here because I'm bringing it in from a known location. I just don't know exactly where it's exiting the house, and that's the potential problem here. It's a cost-effective solution, so you'll see a lot of builders gravitate to this in particular climate zones here. Supply side ventilation often looks like this, where you have a duct run from the outside to the return side of the furnace, and you're using the furnace fan to bring air into the house here. There's some type of control, if I'm not going to be running it continuously, that will turn my fan on to bring in air intermittently there. And there's often a damper in that duct so that I can close it off when the furnace system isn't running if I'm running it intermittently for that ventilation system. Or I might install an inline fan on that piece of duct and run that inline fan to bring air into the house here. So here's two examples of that on the left-hand side here. This is just using the furnace fan in a climate that might mean, or I guess a house construction type where I can't bring it in through a rim joist. So I'm bringing it in, maybe I am a slab on grade house and I don't have a basement where I can bring in air from the outside through the rim joist to the return side of the furnace. This picture on the left is bringing it to the return side of the furnace, but at a return grill. What's nice here is that I can filter that air. You can see that blue filter there as well. But again, I don't have the ability to measure. It's basically more difficult to measure the flow of air coming through that duct in that type of system. In the one on the right is one of those inline fans in the duct running from the outside to the return side of the furnace. I have a little bit more control and predictability. Where I'm going to get more control and predictability is if I used something like this iris damper, where I can change the orifice size here and measure the flow rate across that iris opening there, and I can determine exactly how much air is moved through the system. So if you're using supply side ventilation, you want to specify a damper that has a port where you can measure the flow across the damper there and set that flow rate specific, because otherwise it's really dependent on how close this duct is coming into the return side, how close that is to the furnace fan. That will determine the flow of air through that duct. I can measure that flow with these flow measuring devices on the right side here, but I can't adjust the flow rate like I can with an iris damper there. Now, exhaust ventilation is kind of similar to supply ventilation, but the big thing to know here is that it is a negative pressure strategy. We're creating a negative pressure because we're sucking air out of the house. Any air that leaves the house has to be brought back in, either through a known opening or through random holes in the building envelope. So again, this is a climate-specific depressurization strategy. We like it in our dry climate here in Colorado because generally the air is drier outside the house than it is inside the house. So I'm bringing relatively dry air through my building envelope to the outside here. We do need to worry about combustion safety here. So if you're using an exhaust ventilation strategy, pair it with a sealed combustion or power vented appliances. So we're not going to get combustion safety backdrafting issues. I do have control because I know the amount of air out equals the amount of air in, and I can measure that flow rate. So I can get a solid number there, and I can tweak these fans. I can adjust the fans that I'll show you here in a second here. We also get predictability because I can set run times on these fans. There's no filtration that's really available with these types of systems, although you can do kind of hybrid systems to get some filtration, but it's a very cost-effective strategy. So in dry climates like Colorado and Phoenix and areas in the Southwest here, exhaust ventilation is used a lot here. And it's often used with an upgraded fan that's located in a laundry or a centralized bathroom. There, the big place you don't want to put it is in the master suite, because they do run continuously, or if they're running intermittently, they run a lot. They're very quiet fans, but they do have some noise. So we want to make sure that folks aren't turning them off. There are devices inside of these higher quality fans that you're going to replace that standard bath fan with, so you can adjust the flow, the CFM flow, and the runtime of the fan there, so that you can meet the ASHRAE or code required flow rate for that ventilation system there. Now you can also pair this with a duct running from the outside to the return side of the furnace, so you can have what we call a quasi balanced ventilation system. If you do this, you want to put that iris damper in so you can match the incoming air to the outgoing air to get that kind of quasi-balanced ventilation strategy here. So you can see in this example, there's a damper on the system, so they'll run it intermittently, but ideally on that damper, you can also close it off when you're not running it, but close it off potentially when the furnace fan is, and you might be bringing in more in, or have the ability to measure the flow across that damper and be able to set the flow rate there. Now, here's another example of a exhaust side hybrid system that leverages that duct to the outside. So it runs when the furnace is running as a supply side ventilation system. And then when the furnace isn't running, it runs as an exhaust side ventilation system here. So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds here from a supply and exhaust ventilation strategy in this type of system here. So there are a variety of different ways to hook these systems up, but remember that supply side is a pressurization strategy. Exhaust is a negative depressurization strategy, and there are issues from building durability perspective and health and safety with either of those strategies. So the next strategy is the balanced ventilation strategy that we want to talk about. And balanced ventilation is balanced because it's a neutral pressure strategy. We're taking air out and bringing in air at the same rate and at the same time period here, runtime period, so that we should have neutral pressure that's being caused by the ventilation strategy that's being used. It can work in all climates, which is great. We don't have backdrafting or combustion safety issues that we have to deal with. We shouldn't have building durability issues because we're not bringing uncontrolled air through the building envelope for either pushing it through or sucking it through the building envelope, because we're taking it through actual ports that are designed through that ventilation strategy. I get my control and predictability again, because I know the quantity of air that's moving through the ventilation system, and I have a runtime again. What's also nice is that I can filter that air, but the problem, kind of the downside here, is that it's the most expensive strategy. So it's hard to get a production builder, for example, to install balanced ventilation strategies unless you're using one of those hybrid or quasi-balanced ventilation systems, because these ventilation strategies are pretty expensive. We're talking $1,500 to $2,500 when you're talking about an ERV or an HRV, so a heat recovery ventilator or an energy recovery ventilator. Now, in the 2021 IECC, if you are building or living in climate zones 7 and 8, so Summit County here in Colorado, for example, you are now required to put in a balanced ventilation strategy, and they have gone as far as say you have to do an HRV or an ERV. You can't do one of the quasi-balanced ventilation systems that I described below. Whereas in Boulder County, for example, they also require balanced ventilation, but you could put in a exhaust fan and a supply fan, for example, and do a balanced ventilation strategy that way. In climate zones 7 and 8, you can no longer do that from an IECC perspective here. So how does a balanced ventilation strategy work? So the basics is that you have an airstream that's coming from the outside to the inside, and an airstream that's coming from the inside to the outside, and their flow rate, their CFM rate, is equal to each other. These different airstreams are passing through a core. That's this kind of diamond-shaped device here, but those airstreams don't touch each other. So the core, think of a cardboard corrugated box. And if you look at the edge of that box, you'll see these little channels going through. The air moves through those channels, and those channels are oriented so that the airstreams don't physically cross or mix with each other, but they go through the core, through those little channels there. And that core is made of a material that enables energy to transfer across from one airstream to the other airstream, and potentially moisture to transfer across that core material from one airstream to the other airstream without the airstreams actually mixing together. So you can think of it as a heat exchanger, but a heat exchanger that also has the ability to transfer moisture in specific cases here. Because what we know is that moisture, heat, and energy always move from higher concentrations to lower concentrations. So they're always going to move across these core heat exchangers or moisture exchangers without mixing the air, if we can run them correctly. So the heat recovery ventilator should be pretty obvious that what it does is it moves heat or energy. It pulls fresh air into the home while simultaneously exhausting stale air out to the home. The theory is on cold winter days that fresh air is cold and the exhaust air is warm. So the energy is going to move from the exhaust air across the core exchanger into the fresh air from the outside here. And therefore we can recover that energy that we've spent and we've spent money on to heat that house in the wintertime. And in fact, it does that, and it does that quite well in cold climates here. So the fresh air is generally what we want is the fresh air to be delivered to the living spaces and the stale air to be removed from moist, polluted areas like bathrooms, kitchens, and laundries there. That's the ideal setup here. That would be an independently ducted heat recovery ventilator here. Now, you don't have to independently duct it, but we're not going to go through these other ducting strategies. We are doing if anybody's from Summit County in February, we're going to do a specific presentation on heat recovery and energy recovery ventilators that will go into a lot more depth, and potentially we'll do it for this audience as well, maybe in 2022 or sometime in the future here. Energy recovery ventilators basically do exactly what a heat recovery ventilator does, except it has, depending on the season, has the ability to move moisture in an airstream to a different airstream. So and that different airstream is based on moisture content. So again, moisture moves from higher concentrations to lower concentrations. So let's say in the winter time, in Colorado, I have more moisture inside my house than I have outside that house. So the exhaust air is going to transfer some of its moisture to the incoming drier fresh air that's coming into that house. So I can keep control and predictability not only of the airflow in that, but the moisture content that's happening inside that house as well here. So we're able to transfer heat and moisture with an energy recovery ventilator here. And by doing that, we're starting to see that the old caveat is no longer, the old rule of thumb is no longer really the case anymore, which was that heat recovery ventilators were for cold northern climates and energy recovery ventilators were only for warm, humid climates. They do a good job of ensuring that moisture from the outside isn't coming into that house excessively in hot, humid climates. But we're starting to see more and more energy recovery ventilators being installed in colder climates as well to help control the indoor relative humidity inside that house. On the flip side there, we shouldn't be seeing energy recovery ventilators start being installed in warm, humid climates because it's just going to pump that moisture outside into the house there, and we don't want that. Although energy recovery ventilators can be used in cold climates and dry climates, heat recovery ventilators should not be used in humid climates down south, for example. Regardless of the system that you use, you need to have that control. That's a requirement of the code, so you can turn it off during pollution times like the smoke or car pollution that might be going on. And those controls now need to be labeled. They must be labeled. We also need to think about where that air intake is coming from. We don't want it coming from, the code gives us an idea of how to stretch it from the exhaust duct out there. So it has to be at least 10 feet horizontally and 3 feet vertically away. But we also don't want to take it away off of roofs that might be off-gassing, oils and other things. Those asphalt composite shingles, not a great place to pull your air from. Pet runs, garages, other places we don't want to run that. And then we need to think about obstructions that might happen from those fresh air ports with snow and leaves and other things that might beat it. Again, a reminder that we want the most watt draw efficient, so the lowest watt draw fans in these systems, regardless if it's supply, exhaust, or balanced ventilation, and that watt draw will have an energy penalty on the house, whether it's used or not for code or the HERS index, it does have an energy penalty there. In the 2021 IECC, there's a new requirement that says that mechanical ventilation systems shall be tested and verified to provide the minimum ventilation flow rates required by the ventilation section of the code here. So we're going to be actually testing the fan to see if it's able to blow 50 CFM in that bathroom, 100 CFM in the kitchen, and then the whole house mechanical ventilation rate there. What we're seeing, because Energy Star program requires this type of measurement, is that a lot of times installation of these fans diminishes its ability to push air. What we do know is that the typical builder grade bathroom fan that pushes 50 CFM doesn't push 50 CFM anymore when you attach duct work to it. And especially if that duct work is tortuous, meaning that it has a lot of bends and elbows in it there. So what it will mean probably is that most of these bath fans will have to be upgraded to a better fan that pushes a little bit more air. And that duct installation needs to be substantially better. So it continues, this requirement continues, it says that we have to test according to manufacturer instructions, and it has to be conducted by a third party, and we have to provide a report to the code official that these things have tested and are passed as well. There is an exception for kitchen hoods because kitchen hoods are very difficult to test. So if you have a 6-inch run from your kitchen hood all the way to the outdoors and there's no more than one 90-degree elbow in that duct, you don't need to test it there. There's going to be an assumption that it's able to push 100 CFM of air here. These are different testing devices that are available. When you're doing balanced ventilation systems, you have to test the pressure in each of the supply and return, supply and exhaust sides of the systems. In supply side systems, you want to get that damper in there so that you can measure the flow rate. And in the exhaust side systems, there's generally a flow gauge there that you can adjust the flow of that fan there, but you still need to measure it. And generally you're going to measure it using a flow box type device like this device here, there. And then for hoods, again, you have that exception. If you have a 6-inch duct with one elbow, like the middle pictures here, you don't have to test it, but you have to be able to confirm that that's been installed. That picture on the left here, that would not be compliant. You would have to then measure the flow rate there and ensure that you're getting at least 100 CFM through that system here. So to conclude, ultimately you get what you inspect, not what you expect here. So we're going to run our last poll question here, which is a question about balanced ventilation strategy. So, to conclude from my perspective here, balanced ventilation is the ideal ventilation strategy that we want to use in our houses. The other strategies work, and they're very installation specific in terms of climate and how they're installed. All of these systems have to be inspected because, again, you get what you inspect, not what you expect. But balanced ventilation is a pressure neutral strategy. So we have less concern about combustion safety and health and safety issues, and less concern about that moisture content that's in that air, being able to recover that moisture content if we want to, be able to recover that energy if we want to there. So most of the people are getting what I'm talking about from a balanced ventilation strategy. And although the code doesn't require you to do it, it's the strategy of choice for folks out there. So let's say thank you very much for joining us today. If you have questions and can't stick around, here's my contact information, so don't hesitate to reach out and we will answer some questions there. I'm going to do another quick shameless plug for my podcast. So take a listen to my podcast. The most recent episode is with regards to conduction cooking there. So it looks like we have a couple questions here.
Yep, we've got a few, and we've had one in the chat about your podcast too, Robbie, and I said that you could access it on Spotify quite easily. I actually just looked it up. So
great, thanks.
So that's available to everyone. But yeah, we do have some questions. First, from Dan Weed. If we are building tight and ventilating right, why does the 2021 code not associate how tight the house is anymore regarding blower doors? Now it doesn't care how tight it is, you have to ventilate right anyway.
Yes, because the minimum code required house tightness would automatically mean that you need ventilation. So really anything under 5 air changes per hour, which is the leakiest that you're allowed to build in some climate zones per the IECC, that minimum air tightness or house tightness level dictates that you need ventilation. Even though you're getting a certain amount of air through that house, you're not getting that control and predictability. So that's kind of the other side that the code is trying to stress. That sound building science perspective is the control and predictability that the ventilation is giving us there. So there's kind of two things to that. One is that house tightness is tight enough to warrant ventilation, and ventilation is needed to gain control and predictability of the airflow that's moving through our house. Great question.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. Our local code inspector has been allowing no mechanical ventilation based on the other approved means in the code language. Is that the correct interpretation?
I would say that that is not the correct interpretation. There is a ability for the code official to use that in that way, but from my perspective, and I think other most jurisdictions that are implementing the IECC would say that that is a misuse of other approved means.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that one. All right, 2 more questions. Supply side ventilation would seem to be beneficial to mitigate radon coming into the home through the submembrane. Any comments about crawl space plenum and how to condition a crawl would also be helpful?
Well, I mean, in essence, you're correct, but it brings up the issue with regards to radon that we shouldn't be using our ventilation system to control radon. There are in Appendix F in the IRC that some jurisdictions have adopted, and the the EPA radon guidelines and whatnot. Every single one of them gives us an explanation of having a rock solid vapor barrier, air barrier installed in our crawl spaces underneath our slab floors to not only help control moisture that might be going into our houses, but help control radon gases and other soil gases that might be coming into our houses. Then you have the ability to either install an active or passive radon mitigation system underneath that plastic membrane. Usually it's a plastic membrane that's creating that barrier and running that outside the house. So we should not be using our ventilation systems there for that purposes there. With regards to conditioning a crawl space, there are a variety of ways to do that. One way is to couple it with an exhaust ventilation strategy. We see that often in Colorado because, again, it's relatively cheap and we have drier air outside. So we can pull air, conditioned air from the house through a crawl space and condition the crawl space, and then take that air all the way to the outside and still rely on the random holes in our building envelope for air coming in to ventilate the house. But we're kind of getting double duty to ventilate the house and to condition the crawl space. So that would be one example of a way to deal with that conditioned crawl space.
Great, thank you, Robbie. All right, last question. Can the ERV supply fan track intermittent fan exhaust fan?
I don't believe that ERVs are, I've never seen, I guess, ERV or an HRV connected to an exhaust fan. So often, especially if they're independently ducted, balanced ventilation strategy, you would stick an exhaust port in the bathroom and it would actually replace the bath fan. So you would no longer have a bath fan in the bathroom. You would be using your exhaust ventilation strategy. And then they're hooked on to a switch that has a boost on it, so that when you take a shower, you would boost the ventilation system to get that moisture up and out of the house while you're doing it. You can also put an exhaust into the kitchen as long as it's far enough away from the stove and has a filter on it to keep grease out of the system there. So you can in essence get rid of your hood, although it would be beneficial to continue to have your hood in case you burn something or you're boiling 50 quarts of water for a large spaghetti dinner or something. There you're cooking Thanksgiving dinner coming up here there. But I guess the base answer to your question is no, I haven't seen it directly connected to a simple exhaust fan.
Okay, well, that wraps up all our questions for today. Thank you again, Robbie, for a great presentation, and I hope to see you all next month. We'll be presenting on compliance pathways. So actually, we've got a raised hand, so I'm just going to stop the recording.